were promised certain foods, certain crops to be given to them. That never happened. They continued to starve. It was, when we look back in history, they will talk about the mistreatment of Germany, especially in World War I, and then the reparations that they had to pay, even though they were not given what they were promised. And that's just the first paragraph. I mean, this is crazy. You know, it's just crazy. All right, let's go to the second paragraph. And I may interrupt just to give you information because I think you deserve that in order to understand this armistice. And President Wilson, by the way, had gone into a coma at one point, and there was 23 acts of Congress that were passed without his signature. So President Wilson was not in good health. This was more towards the beginning of his administration. This is something I just happen to know because I like to study the presidents. It's interesting. This is part of the reason why we also have the 25th Amendment, because of President Wilson's demise. So, all right. Let's go ahead and start at the last sentence. This all is very sad and depressing. The victors refused even to discuss the terms of peace with the vanquished, who had surrendered on stated conditions, which officers do, which were not fulfilled, and the general discredited democracy in German eyes by associating it with German pleasures, national humiliation, and economic distress. The Nazi movement, born from the dragon seeds planted at Versailles and brought to monstrous growth by the World Depression, which raised the total number of unemployed in Germany to 6 million, took power at the moment of Europe's and America's greatest economic crisis. Inevitably, the Second World War followed the first after an interval of only 20 years. They do have a note at the bottom of page 1. Let's take a look at that. It does note speaking, so I will. Referring to the armistice, Maynard Keyes in 1919 wrote in his prophetic book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace. That's Maynard, M-A-Y-N-A-R-D, Keyes, K-E-Y-N-E-S. In 19, wrote in his prophetic book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace. Quote, the nature of the contract between Germany and the Allies is plain and unequivocal. The terms of the peace are to be in accordance with the addresses of the President, and the purpose of the peace conference is, again quote, to discuss the details of their application, end quote. The circumstances of the contract were of unusually solemn and binding character, for one of the conditions of it was that Germany should agree to the armistice terms, which were to be such as would leave her helpless. ... The honor of the Allies was thus peculiarly involved in fulfilling their part, and if they were ambiguities, in not using their position to take advantage of them, end quote. Saying that the Allies could skip out, but Germany could not. Okay. Let's go on to second page. All right. So 20 years have passed. Instead of learning that you cannot build confidence and security, democracy and prosperity on a foundation of hatred and vengeance, the victorious Allies this time have torn Germany apart, deprived her of all possibility of existence without exterior aid, and while unable to agree upon themselves on a peace treaty, have jointly reduced the defeated enemy country to the status of an African colony. History is repeating itself with likely results to be even more tragic for Europe than the events which led up to World War II. Once again, the victorious Allies are making it impossible for the Germans to place their faith in democracy and justice, since they just found justice denied and democracy mocked by the occupying powers. Once again, the German Democrats are in danger of yielding right away to the totalitarians because legal methods and appeals to justice are again failing to obtain a fair deal for the German people. One moment. Last time, we produced Hitler. This time, we may succeed in giving Stalin hegemony over all of Europe. If France, following World War I, had been prepared to treat Germany as generously and intelligently as England had treated France after Napoleon's defeat, Europe might have known another century of peace. The long conflict between Germany and France could have ended on terms as advantageous to both and as conducive to European peace as the Anglo-French collaboration, which succeeded centuries of rivalry and war between England and France. Instead, France sought a fictitious security by disarming the Teutonic giant while giving him every reason to plot for revenge. The crushing burden of reparations the Germans were required to pay, and the denial to Germany of a secure and honorable status among the nations of Europe, so enfeebled German democracy that the Nazis won power, and France was overwhelmed by forces she herself had created. It may be true that the lesson to be learned from history is that the mankind learns nothing from it. But the explanations for the failure of the Western democracies to read the lesson of the immediate past seems mainly due to the effect of war propaganda and the ignorance or lack of integrity of the molders of public opinion. The pen is still mightier than the sword, and responsible for more human misery when unscrupulously employed in psychological warfare. As Samuel Johnson wrote in the 18th century, quote, "I know not whether more is to be feared from streets filled with soldiers accustomed to plunder, or from garrets filled with scribblers accustomed to lie." End quote. War propaganda and the falsification of history indulged in by a multitude of journalists, authors, professors, and politicians has convinced the American public that the Germans have a peculiar aversion to democracy and are innately aggressive people who will always attempt to rule the world unless kept down and taught to love democracy by a long period of instruction in a reformatory. Only those who have studied the history of Europe know that Germany did not become a militarist nation until centuries of French aggression, from the days of Waterloo to Napoleon's conquest, have caused a reaction which enabled Prussia to forge the modern German state out of this disunited and powerless concierge of kingdoms, principalities, and free cities, which constituted, quote, the Germanies, end quote, before the French Revolution. Americans who have dinned it into their ears for years that Germany had attacked France 3 times within living memory will be astonished at reading at what was said at a time in Britain and the United States about the Franco-Prussian War. The London Times on July 16, 1870 wrote, wrote as follows, quote, "The greatest national crime that we have had the pain of recording in these columns since the days of the First French Empire have been consummated. War is declared, an unjust but premeditated war. The dire calamity which overwhelms Europe with dismay is, it is now too clear, the act of France, of one man in France. It is the ultimate result of personal rule. There can be no doubt as to the side on which the world's sympathies will be enlisted, and whatever may on former occasions have been the offenses of Prussia, she will now in this instance have on our side all the moral support which is seldom denied to those who take up arms in self-defense." End quote. George Bancroft, the U.S. minister in Berlin, reported as follows. One moment. Quote, "The leading statesmen, as well as public opinion in America, regard the present war essentially as an act of self-defense on Germany's part, and the outstanding task is to ensure Germany permanently by a better system of frontiers against new wars of aggression on the part of her western neighbors, of which the past 3 centuries have been brought so large of number." End quote. The tragedy of modern history is that the Germans have always been kicked around when they have been pacifically minded, with the natural resort that the apostles of violence have again and again won the leadership of the nations. Following the failure of the Democrats and anti-militarists to win the fair deal for the German people or protect them from attack. Having finally girded their loins to resist French aggression and force France to abandon her centuries-old ambition to establish her hegemony over the continent, the Germans proceeded, once Bismarck's influence was withdrawn, to follow in France's footsteps. Nevertheless, the popular conception of the Germans as the cause of all recent wars is erroneous. In the half-century which elapsed between the Franco-Prussian War and World War I, Germany was at peace, whereas Britain and France conquered most of Africa and extended their Asiatic colonial empires. Russia fought Turkey and Japan, and the United States acquired new territory by wars with Spain, and Mexico. Having both studied and taught history at London University in the 1920s, when war passions had cooled, and had the privilege of knowing the eminent British historian Dr. Chpt, who was with other scholars was establishing the facts concerning the causes of World War I am also aware that Germany cannot be regarded solely responsible for the first act in the tragedy of Western civilization. Diplomatic documents made public by the Bolsheviks, together with those from the Vienna archives, proved that Tsarist Russia and the Habsburgs were more responsible for the outbreak of war than Germany. As Gustav Stoepfer has written, quote, "Not one historian of the international repute of any nationality during the 20s and early 30s maintained that Germany alone was responsible, while several outstanding historians, particularly British and American, went far in establishing Germany's comparative innocence." End quote. The facts of history were overlaid by propaganda during World War II and are today forgotten. But one can't deny that after their defeat in World War I, the Germans for a time swung back and embraced pacifism and democracy with the same fervor as they had formerly followed their militarists. The Constitution of the Weimar Republic guaranteed so many freedoms that allowed license to both communists and Nazis, first to undermine and then finally destroy the German Republic. The Weimar Republic may have survived its own inner weaknesses if France had been willing to bury the hatchet and pursue as enlightened a policy towards Germany, as the British, who soon after the war's end realized the stupidity of stifling the democratic forces in Germany by the full implementation of the Versailles Treaty. One moment, please. Okay, just had to make sure.